background and perhaps what brought you into this program?
Sure. So I've luckily made a lot of collaborations happen in the past. I organized seminars and workshops that brought together government officials with academics and civil society representatives to come together, exchange perspectives, and work together on policy recommendations on specific human rights issues. And just last year, I was part of a project called Faculty for Future that created a global network of academics who work on sustainability issues with the aim of connecting them with academics from all over the world and with practitioners and local organizations that have more practical experience. And my particular role was to connect academics from the global north and the global south, as well as academics with local organizations. And it's tough work. It's, collaboration is a buzzword, it's taken for granted, but the reality is that a lot of people don't know where to begin with even identifying the relevant kind of expertise that should come into the conversation, as well as how to manage a collaboration. So what I've learned is that it's simply not enough to put together a bunch of people with different backgrounds and different expertise and expect innovative solutions. Often these conversations need skillful facilitation, as well as a lot of self-management that we're perhaps not used to do when it comes to working with other people. What I found in particular is that there's always the elephant in the room is the power inequalities between people, because we're talking about people coming with different backgrounds, different expertise. You will inevitably have dominant attitudes and dominant perspectives and people projecting more authority in the conversation. And the last thing you want in this kind of space is to recreate and reproduce the kind of inequalities that are out there in the world in your conversation. So there's a lot to manage from the human side of things. Of course, you need knowledge about the frameworks of how to do proper dialogue and listen to each other, but equally as important is the interpersonal skills and how we carry ourselves with one another.
For sure, absolutely. Sanjeev, let me bring you in here. Why was AFC attracted to support this program? What's related to AFC's work and why it fits to the core of what AFC does?
Yeah, so obviously I must start with a huge apology to everybody. And it so happens my carbon footprint this morning is pretty poor because it's got a flight that took a taxi and that did a bit of running, so it's probably okay. Kind of got to net zero at some point. Okay. No, so from an AFC perspective, I think AFC is the multilateral Pan-African infrastructure financing company. So the question is relevant, like, what are we doing with this? And I think it's very subtle, but it's actually very profound. And that is that as we go around the world raising money for projects on the African continent, as you will appreciate, given the climate agenda, given the narrative around which the climate agenda is being played out, and the prioritization, if you like, that is happening across the global community on what projects to fund, what projects not to fund, which regions to go to, which regions not to go to, when to do gas, when not to do gas, do coal, but not for you, only for me. Those kind of stuff is huge, right? So as an African institution which raises anywhere between $2 to $3 to $4 billion of new funding from global markets, it's critical for us that those custodians of that capital, the sources of those capital, the decision makers of those capital, appreciate the realities in which we operate, right? The huge development challenge that we have, the climate agenda has to fit into that. It cannot be isolated. So it's in that context that we do a lot of work. We do a lot of thought leadership work, which I can talk about. Why we believe that the problem is common, but the solutions are not necessarily common. Why I personally dismiss the terminology, we are in it together, because we are not in it together, right? But that's a different debate I can have later on. But just to come back to the question, so for us, therefore, as much as we do in terms of thought leadership, nuancing the conversations, making people see things pragmatically, we also felt that the younger leaders, I hate to use the word young, but you know what I'm saying, the aspiring future leaders, because future leaders may not necessarily be young, those leaders need to also understand the issue that is confronting the global south, and in particular, the African continent. So we felt that why not start something which hopefully we can build upon, where essentially we bring 50 people from the global south and let them start having conversations with decision makers, role players, influencers, captains of industry, and see what their thoughts can be translated to in terms of actual actions that is more structured and hopefully more helpful and constructive to the African continent. So it's really that. So if I may use a word, you could probably say it's our way of creating some soft power. And maybe it'll work, we'll see.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah. So, Adi, I want to turn back to you and then I want to, a bit later, we'll hopefully have time to open it up to the audience for your perspectives as well. Not necessarily questions, you may have questions, but you may also just have perspective, because this is about discovery. So in the discovery, what in perhaps some detail or illustration do you see as the gaps between perceptions in the global north and south?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on Sanjeev's point about decision making. I think the world needs decision making to be different, and it's okay to say that, but unless we give the next generation, not using the word young, Sanjeev, I'll stick with next generation, unless we identify those who are keen to step forward and want to learn and lead in a different way and create spaces for them, just like Julia has been telling us about. So this was very much AFC's vision and totally aligned with what Common Purpose does and is about. How do you create that space, a safe space to have the difficult conversations, the courageous conversations, the conversations that are probably not happening, which is why things are not shifting. The more you do the same thing in the same way, you're not going to solve the problem, So I think this was very much about that vision of how do you create a space for people from different backgrounds, the global north, the global south, in an initiative, Sanjeev's point about soft power, led by Africa, because we do a lot of work all over the world, but this was an opportunity for us to be a part of something which was very much truly led by Africa. Create the space, bring that next generation together, and get them to have a good go at trying to solve a climate challenge. Now, are they going to fully solve the challenge by giving X number of their hours over a leadership program? Probably not. Are they going to shift mindsets significantly for themselves and for the other stakeholders? Absolutely they will. So the ambition is, how do you get the next generation to come together to learn differently so that they can themselves lead differently and really influence the current crop of stakeholders to think differently. So that's the overarching aim and ambition of the program. I can go into the details in terms of what that entails, but what I'm really trying to say is where's the sweet spot in terms of the ambition and the desire for change.
Okay, so Julia, a lot of weight on your shoulders here. As the next generation, how
and young.
Where do you begin? How do you take on the gerontocracy in organisations? Where there's a natural deferral to seniority, perhaps. How do you tackle these? I appreciate we're right at the beginning of the program, so you may have more to say on this in a couple of months. But yeah, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's definitely a challenge. That's why you see trainings like this coming up. And I wanted to pick up on the idea of soft power. I like the idea of soft power, but I think before it becomes soft power, all these voices and perspectives need to be given equal consideration in the debate, and then they can lead further with a different kind of approach. And that's what's lacking. There's a lot of voices and perspectives that are, I don't like to use the word voices actually, perspectives that are marginalized and have been historically marginalized in academia, in industry, in every aspect of society. Where do you begin? Trainings like this, you begin with shifting mindsets, with really understanding when you're dealing with this kind of collaboration. It's really obvious, but it's not. I don't know why. You put together people coming from very different backgrounds and understanding that those everyday realities are different. And especially when you talk about developed countries in the global north, in the west, that live completely unsustainable lifestyles. You put people from these countries in the room with people from less developed countries that pollute the least, and on top of that are at the forefront of climate impact. So how do you create understanding between those kind of perspectives? You really need to learn to listen and to understand that the immediate needs and priorities on the ground in these different contexts are different. There's no one size fits all solution, and I think we're very drawn, especially in the sustainability space, we're very drawn to big technological ideas, carbon capture and storage, but often we really overlook the social impacts on the ground, like the massive amount of land that we need to implement these solutions. The human social dimension is oftentimes overlooked. So it has to be, and they're interdependent. That's what I wanted to say. There's as much about the differences between the experiences and the priorities and the needs on the ground, but also that every action decision that is made in one place will impact the other. I mean, when it comes to nature, we are dependent on this small planet that we share, and it will be, we're interdependent.
Can I just come in? Sorry, I think just because we're talking about solutions and collaboration, for genuine collaboration to happen, which is what I think the world is talking about or wants, some part of the world wants, you've got to put people at the heart of it. So I suppose what you're saying, Yulia, and what we are trying to create is technology will be the solution. Government intervention, government regulation, government policy will be the solution. But you've got to put people at the heart of the conversation as a problem, the human element that Yulia was talking about. And I think for that you can't tell people what to do. You've got to do it through influence, through persuasion, through building networks, through analytical and creative thinking, and that's really what we are trying to do here with AFC's support and collaboration.
So Sanjeev, bring it back to Africa and the global south, if you will. Every day you're at the coalface, so to speak, let's call it a renewable energy space instead, where you are tackling projects, some of them climate related, some of them renewables, some of them in the broader industrialization and economy, and you're pushing against very often an investor perspective from the global north, which raises real challenges to some of that. How does AFC navigate the often very global north influenced agenda on climate? How do you put your perspective out there of what net zero should look like from an African perspective?
Well, Africa is also already on net zero. It's a data point that people don't necessarily refer to because Africa, as you know, as a continent, has less than 4% of global emissions. And then if you bring in the absorption of the world's pollution that Africa's forests do, then you could probably argue that Africa is on a net negative, not even positive zero, if there is a negative zero, that is. But the point that I don't want to, inadvertently make or be seen to be making is that there is a rejection of any form about the challenge of the global warming and the climate agenda. As we know, pollution has no borders. Right? So we are essentially on the continent, arguably disproportionately affected by the effect of climate change, because it's a continent which is, singularly poor and inadequate in its infrastructure, countries have many physical challenges. So what it means is that nature in its full bounty that it provides generally is a huge source of sustenance for the continent, right? So people's livelihoods, people's food supply, people's mobility is based on nature, river, rain patterns, weather patterns. So when the climate change brings changes to the weather patterns, the rain patterns, dries up rivers, dries up lakes, it has a direct effect on the continent. You know, it's not about, oh, I'm going to put my heater off for a couple of hours every day. It's about not having access to your school because the river that you used to wade through to go to school doesn't exist anymore. It's not about, oh, I'll eat a little less because let's reduce our conspicuous consumption. It's about access to food itself, because the land which you were tilling to grow some crops is no longer a fertile land, right? So I think this must be understood, that the effect of the climate change, which in Billy Joel's song, we didn't light the fire, Africa didn't light the fire, but the effect of it is being disproportionately felt. So obviously, therefore, from our side as a Pan-African institution, we take the climate agenda very seriously. Not because it's a fashionable thing to do, not because it's a futuristic aspiration, because it is a current day, ever-present problem. So that's why, you will be happy to know, Gavin, that today the institution that I represent has the largest platform of renewable power assets on the continent. Right? We are pioneers in building wind, solar, power stations. Our infrastructure, incidentally, the infrastructure we build, the bridges and the roads and what have you, we put in resiliency into it for future climate changes, right? Which adds costs to the project, which we can ill afford, but we have done the simulations to show that over time it pays for itself, right? So this whole aspect of climate and how we manage it and how we have to finance it is part of what we do. But the reason why this conversation, Gavin, was important to us is that we want to challenge the linearity of the argument, that the tyranny of the or, as they call it, right? Because unfortunately, the African continent, unlike other regions, does require a lot more capital to come into the region, because we have, on a relative basis, a shortage of domestic capital, right? And that is why we are being questioned at every stage when we raise money. What's your ESG? What's your carbon footprint? And all I want is to say that as we develop Africa, as we finance sustainable infrastructure, as we start processing Africa's primary goods more at source, which incidentally reduces global shipping and reduces emissions, we will reach the standards that the global West or the global North wants us to reach. It's not going to happen overnight. It cannot happen overnight. Development will lead to prosperity. Prosperity will lead to doing things in a more sophisticated way. But if you throw the book of sophistication up front to us, then the agenda of development will die at the altar of this linearity. And that is the point that I hope that the future leaders of today will explore. It is not about rejecting, it is about assimilating views and creating solutions that are pragmatic, and incidentally what is happening to the rest of the world in any case. I mean, no energy mix in 2075 talks about no carbon fossil fuels. It talks about net zero. Net zero is a function of plus and minus. So why can't we have a plus? Why should we only concentrate on the minus? And that's how I see it. It's a mathematical argument.
I see Adi and Yulia
Yeah.
quibbling notes and nodding furiously.
No, I just
Adi,
wanted to, I really
just before you do,
Sorry.
I'm going to open it up if there is any perspective from the audience in a moment. But Adi, please.
Sure, yeah, just this point of non-linearity is never quite safe, but thank you. Because I think that is really it. How do you create spaces between talent, next generation talent from the global north, global south, to come together and to have the real conversation. Some of the examples and the stories Sanjeev was sharing about the reality from the continent are some things that a lot of people probably don't even know. So how do you create that sort of, that opportunity for people to share those stories, to really gain the insights, so that they can start to think about innovation differently. Innovation is not just about solving the problem. Innovation is about truly, truly embracing difference. You've got to put difference and engaging with difference at the heart of innovation to truly get innovation, because otherwise you're going to get innovation coming from homogeneity or linear thinking, which is never really innovative. So I think that importance of non-linear, truly engaging with difference, understanding people's lived experiences before you even try to solve the problem, is what I hope AFC would want to see out of this, which is what I hope people also deliver.
Gavin, will you allow me to make a 60-second comment?
It's up to you, Leah. She's the boss here.
I love what I'm hearing. So
Just a 60-second comment to kind of buttress the point I was trying to make. Africa is home to pretty much 30 to 60% of the world's critical minerals, the minerals that is needed for the batteries and what have you, right? So it is a logical conclusion that people can make that there should be a focused investment in that sector in Africa, because that will solve the world's problem, right? However, you'll be pleased to know that highly sophisticated economies, highly prosperous economies like Norway, has instead decided to do deep sea mining. Our chief investment officer is sitting at the back. He can tell you the data that the manganese that you get from the seabed is like 15% concentration, and you have to dig like 2 kilometers deep, while you get manganese at 40% concentrate, which is lying on the ground in Africa. So where is the sense here? The other point I'll make quickly is on the gas, the argument on gas. Because till the Ukraine war happened, there was this consensus that thou shalt not do gas, right? And then it all went up in air and gas, because gas is back. Now, in Africa's case, why we need to do gas is not because we want to reject or we want to challenge, but because do you know that today the majority of energy that is required in Africa, because we have a power deficit on the continent, the energy usage is really for cooking, right? And the cooking is done largely by firewood. And that firewood comes from trees. And those trees, I believe, scientists tell me, absorb emissions. So why can't we do gas and provide CNG and LPG and whatever the technical term is, and stop the felling of trees? So I just thought I'll give you those two examples. Why, again, this platform is important, because I want the future leaders to dwell on it, on explore it, poke it, probe it. It's not us saying it, it's a reality.
And really understand it.
No, I've realised I'm a complete dinosaur because I was looking to the audience for questions, and my colleague Mark has pointed out that all the questions are in front of me. So we've now got 6 minutes to answer 3 questions. So it's like 30 seconds each, maximum answers. Firstly, how can European asset owners and investors help in Africa while also maintaining returns?
I think, well, for me, it would be more participation in our kind of conversation, because like I said at the start, one of the things I really want is more and more people, from the world of investment, to be a part of these conversations. Because if you have investment conversations in a separate platform and not a part of this, then the world will not understand some of the things that are put in that question. So that would be a very selfish response to that question. But I think Sanjeev probably would want to come in on that, or you might want to come in.
I'm hoping this is a topic we can explore in the training.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm very, very eager to hear
Happy to
what
create the
participants
space for
have
it.
to say, and then learning from their lived experiences and their vision.
So, Gavin, the way I see it is that human history has shown us that human beings react to 3 basic sentiments: grief, guilt, and fear. Right? And from a European point of view, the guilt part should get removed, and it should be replaced by fear and greed, right? And I say it because the problems that Europe in particular is grappling with are what? Access to energy, food supply, diversification of supply chains, combating immigration, and finding carbon credits. Those are the 5 big issues European countries and European private sector is grappling with. And all those 5, the solutions exist in Africa. So don't do it for Africa, Do it because you need it. And that's how I think the narrative has to change. Do it for yourself.
Okay, you're going to keep the spotlight, I'm afraid, because the next two questions are specifically for you,
Okay.
Sanjeev. Sorry. But the structure of capital markets, e.g. concentrated shareholding in many emerging markets, limits the ability of investors to influence companies. Brief comment on that.
Okay, the reference is to the capital markets on the African continent itself. Sorry.
The structure of capital markets,
Yeah.
for example, concentrated shareholdings in many emerging markets, limits the ability of investors to influence companies.
It's a fact. I mean, I'm not going to try in a 2-minute answer to try and explain why it is so and how it can be resolved, but it's a fact. But what I'll also say is that the need is so huge, the opportunities are so big, that what is not there in terms of capital markets, what is not there in terms of certain traditional mechanisms through which investors come in, is a fact. However, there are institutions like ours who can work with private sector capital, can mitigate risk for the global capital to come into Africa, take away some of the currency volatilities that you guys don't like, and therefore effectively mobilize the funding we require for Africa's development. So what I'm really saying to you, Gavin, is don't worry about what we don't have, because that's not going to change tomorrow, but we do have some other mechanisms that allows private sector capital to come in.
Okay. And really making you pay for your late appearance now. Third question for you is, how do you feel European regulation could be better tailored to enable capital to flow to the global south without being penalised on ESG grounds? So how can capital better flow to the global south?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I sympathize with the policymakers, because they are under pressure to have policies and make capital allocation a function of those policies. So I respect the situation they're in. But the point is the point I made earlier, that if you look at the UN SDG goals, there are 17 of them, right? And climate related issues are just 1 or 2 of them. There's many other goals. So hopefully the European policymakers will not make their ESG framework so narrow that it forgets the wider SDG goal aspirations. And that's probably the way to have that approach that is pragmatic.
Thank you. Adi, after this program has completed, where do you want things to be? What impact will this program have?
Look, I mean, firstly, this is about engagement, and this is about making sure that as many diverse stakeholders as possible are part of the conversation. Those who have not had an opportunity in the past, you talk about it's not about voices, it's about perspectives. I think both are important. So I think what we would like is, true and proper engagement so that people really understand the issues. There's a question there around loss and damage reparations. I don't think a lot of that is even understood. Forget trying to answer the question about where we stand on it. So I think there needs to be a bit of a level playing field in terms of understanding people's lived experiences, where they come from, heritage, practices, etc. So my hope, in answer to your question, is this program will help do that, or it will start the process of doing that. And I hope more and more institutions, more and more investors like AFC, and a huge thank you to them again, will step in and create spaces for organizations like us and others to do more work in this space, because that's where the real change will happen. Otherwise, we will not shift the needle on this.
Yulia, you get the last word. You spoke about social impacts on the ground. What are your recommendations for ensuring indigenous communities are engaged by investors?
I mean, I wish there was an easy answer to this. It's difficult enough sometimes to have academics work with policymakers, not to mention investors directly with indigenous communities. That's probably not the realistic scenario anyway. We'll have local organizations that know the protocols of engaging with indigenous people, that know their local ways of their worldview and what they need, and to engage with them on the immediate priorities. there's a lot of ethical implications and people shy away, and it is a real issue, and a lot of universities, for example, are now creating a lot of standards on how to engage with indigenous communities, and I think there's a lot to learn from those sorts of research collaborations in the private sector space on how to make sure that those perspectives are represented in these discussions.
Yeah.
I've mentioned mindset again. You know, it's not just okay for people to say they want to have the conversation. When you come to have the conversation, you've got to come with the right frame of mind, because there might be some hard truths to listen and learn from. And if people are not willing to do that, then nothing will change.
And Gavin, essentially, the generation and the countries that created the problem can't just be trusted to solve the problem. It needs to be a wider audience.
Too true. Sanjeev, Adi, Yulia, thank you. I wish you the best of luck with the program, and perhaps we'll be here next year to reflect on how it went. Thank you very much.